In August of 2023, amid a flurry of exciting new game releases, EA published a magic-based first-person shooter which spectacularly failed to make an impression. Obviously, their release timing was poor, but their marketing was pretty lackluster too, because if you'd asked someone at the time if they were planning on playing Immortals of Aveum, they would have likely assumed that you were just mispronouncing Baldur's Gate 3. I tried to keep up with most, if not all, of the big game releases in a year, but I know I'm not alone in that the first time that Immortals of Aveum really showed up on my radar was when the developers at Ascendant Studios announced that they'd be laying off half their workforce because the game had not sold well. And I truly don't think there's a worse way to hear about a game for the first time. I had probably heard the name before and maybe even seen a trailer in passing, but it's likely I would have filtered it out, assuming that EA were presenting me with yet another generic live service game that I don't have the time for. It's definitely not live service though. In fact, it doesn't even contain microtransactions selling you weapon skins or Star Wars themed armor. It's all single player and completely self-contained. And though it's painfully bad in quite a few ways, it's also genuinely a ton of fun. I think it's important to say up front that there is a good game somewhere in Immortals of Aveum. In the late game especially, the magic FPS gameplay really comes into its own, and I will get back to that later. First though, I have to talk about the story and all the ways it fails to deliver, because unfortunately, the less than stellar writing here really does pose a huge barrier to the fun on offer.
Say again? I'm losing you.
You do know I can just see you waving your hand around, right?
In the simplest terms I know how to put it, the story of Immortals of Aveum revolves around a magic war in a fantasy realm where the magic itself is destroying that world. Our hero here is Jack, who finds himself at the centre of this conflict and fights his way towards ending the war and repairing the rift in this universe. The story is not especially original then, but on a macro scale at least, it does have potential, right? And without spoiling any specific plot details, it does function from beginning to end as a reasonably cohesive series of events which lead to a theoretically satisfying ending. And yet, the closer you look at the details, the more it falls apart. Everything in Immortals of Aveum happens almost exactly as you'd expect. There are technically twists and turns, but nothing truly surprising ever occurs. There is a moment in the game where the player discovers the true identity of one of the side characters, and I think it's meant to be a huge and exciting revelation, but it just feels like a dumb and extremely obvious plot twist. I literally sighed out loud when it happened. I was desperately praying for this game to surprise me, but it never really did. I recall another specific moment where you attend a pretty tame party and can talk to various characters, and then you're sent off to bed. And I remember thinking, some or all of these characters are about to perish and I'm going to wake up in the middle of chaos and have to fight my way out. Or maybe someone will try to assassinate me, or something else crazy might happen. But instead, you wake up and you're back to training exercises before being sent out on a mission. A lot of the story just plods along like that, and it really doesn't take many risks. That said, I don't consider it a sin in and of itself for a game to stick to a familiar plot to serve as a basic structure for a series of exciting gameplay scenarios. And in that sense, I think it does succeed. There's plenty of toing and froing and many diverse settings which break up the gameplay in an interesting way. So, on paper, it doesn't detract from the fun of the game that the story is so conventional. What does detract, though, is the quality of the writing here in the way the story is presented. Because a great deal of the dialogue here is actually painful to sit through.
You know, we're still not really sure who built this place. A bit morbid, really. Having a massive death list right when you walk in, now that I think about it. Oh, hello.
Now, I don't want to sit here and say that this is a lazy, badly written game, because nobody sets out to tell a bad story, and I respect that a great deal of work has clearly gone into it. And besides that, I think the problem here is actually a lot more specific than it just being bad. That problem, unfortunately, is also a familiar one. It's the Joss Whedon, Tony Stark-esque, snarky, quirky dialogue which has infected so much of the modern media landscape. I would like to believe then that this is an earnest attempt at capturing that writing style which so many others have tried and failed at since the release of the Avengers. It's possible even that the original concept for the game, which took around 5 years to develop, was partly defined by mirroring the style of those MCU films, and from then on it was a specific mandate. Obviously, this style worked for the Avengers and several other films, but it has only grown more tiresome in recent years, and Immortals of Aveum definitely fails to capture that breezy action flick tone for several reasons, and it's rarely, if ever, actually funny. I'd hate to spend too long dissecting what comedy really is here, because there's a million reasons why one thing or another is funny to a few or many people. And I'll admit that it's possible that a few people will enjoy Immortals of Aveum's whole style. I'll say for a start though that the Tony Stark pastiche wisecracks don't work for me at all when every single character is trying to be Tony Stark. One of the big reasons why I think his quips were ever funny is that Tony Stark would come in with a humorous remark to break the tension. And though he had plenty of good one-liners, I think that in his best appearances they were used sparingly and always succeeded as a result. The Avengers would be in a serious situation and everyone else would be taking it seriously, and then Tony Stark would come in and say something witty and it would be legitimately funny. Because it's unexpected, because it's a point of contrast, because of the stoic reactions of everyone else in the room, and because it was a well-written punchline to a joke the audience didn't know they were being told. And let's give credit where credit is due, it's also because of Robert Downey Jr.'s very specific and brilliant performance, which I don't think has been recaptured since. Most of the time, I think this style of comedy only works when almost everyone else is playing the straight man. When characters take turns offering bad one-liners, as they do in Immortals of Aveum, you have no one there to react. It's like watching a bunch of mates in the pub competing to be the funniest when none of them have ever been funny in their lives. And without picking on any character specifically, a lot of the performances here feel flat and awkward and leave a lot to be desired, and that definitely doesn't help things. The big mistake of the writing here was thinking that enough mildly funny retorts inserted between plot details would make it work, but it feels so tonally wrong. And this pattern becomes so obvious so quickly in almost every conversation. Basically, each line alternates between exposition and quips. It's exposition, quip, even in the most dire situations. Oh no, the world is ending. What else is new? We need to find the magic MacGuffin. Well, darn it. I can't believe I left my MacGuffin map at home today. This magic crystal will let you float. I guess I forgot to tell you that I'm afraid of heights. The ratio is all wrong from the start, and it just feels like they're throwing everything at the wall and seeing what sticks. And given that most of these lines wouldn't be funny in any context, it rarely works. But maybe worse than that is simply that the jovial attitudes of these characters are totally at odds with the stakes of the story. At the end of the day, if these characters aren't taking the story or the world building seriously, then why should the player? It really feels at times like you're just told not to care about any of the world-ending danger that's on show here. Even the game's villain feels utterly ridiculous because every encounter with him is just another joke battle. Immortals of Aveum wants you to believe that these characters are caught in the middle of a brutal, never-ending battle which has not only claimed many lives but destroyed their world in the process. And yet, every other line of dialogue here is a toe-curling quip. I love comedy in all its forms, and I want to see more, not less of it, in games. Because I always like any fictional universe more when it's complex enough that it can contain a little bit of humour here and there. But as hard as Immortals of Aveum tries, it really isn't that funny. And more often than not, the attempts at humour sabotage the world building instead. I don't want to pretend like it's all bad, because there are a couple of nice moments of levity, and there was even one specific moment where the game pierced through my hard outer shell and actually legitimately made me laugh out loud. Mostly though, I found myself rolling my eyes at the dialogue and not taking the apparently serious bits of the game seriously.
Like, for real?
More like absorbed into the path and removed from existence. But don't sweat it. I believe in you. She definitely thinks you're going to die. That's why her face looks like that.
The world of Aveum will feel pretty familiar to anyone who's played, watched, or read widely in the fantasy genre. I wouldn't go so far as to call it generic, but it certainly draws from a lot of obvious sources for the foundation of its world building. The way the magic functions, the way the world looks, and the way that characters are dressed will all resemble things that you've probably seen before, but with some new, needlessly complicated explanations. It seems a little bit unfortunate as a new IP that they didn't take greater risks in building out the lore for this universe, but obviously it's designed to be as broadly appealing to fans of the genre as possible. That's not to say it doesn't differentiate itself in some ways though, or at the very least there were several aspects which felt new to me as someone who enjoys the genre but definitely hasn't seen everything that it has to offer. And for what it's worth, it does seem like a decent amount of effort went into figuring out how the magic works here and the way it affects the people of Aveum. And Aveum is a mostly beautiful place too. Again, a lot of the locations here are forgettable fantasy staples, but there are several unique and interesting locations too. I really liked the weird under a fancy bridge town where you start the game. It was distinctive, fun to navigate, and it felt like a semi-believable place. But there were only a couple of locations in the rest of the game which recaptured that for me. Maybe that's because past this opening they mostly feel a bit too polished and generic, as opposed to grungy and lived in. For a lot of the semi-open sections of the game set around castle outskirts and medieval villages, it seemed like the world was remarkably intact considering it was supposed to be the battleground for a never-ending war. Again though, there are some wonderful set pieces here set in some interesting locations, but overall it feels like the game falls short of building an authentic world that I'd want to invest a lot of time in. To give you a greater idea of the occasionally undercooked world building in this game, I'll refer you to this thing, which essentially acts as a phone, allowing the characters to talk to each other in-game and see one another's face inside the crystal. These things are called far cool stones. Do you get it? Because you can call someone from far away with them? Because it's a stone, but you use it to call people from afar. It's a far cool stone. These stones also, remarkably, lose signal at various points in the game, just like a real phone. Apparently because of lack of magic something or other, but let's be real here, these things exist as do the portals in the game, chiefly as a means of moving the plot along at an action movie pace in a fantasy world where you'd usually expect such things to move a little bit slower. The greatest, most interesting aspect of this world for me is the wound. In the story, there is an excess of exposition explaining this wound, but the simple version is that anyone using magic is contributing to a great big chasm that is opening up at the center of the world and threatening to destroy everything. And so the magic war is killing the realm in the process. This, I think, is a great story point because it makes people on both sides of the war into bad guys. And it's a natural parallel to the effects of real war. It's fairly well utilised for a good portion of the story too, but I don't like how they develop it towards the ending. and I generally wish that they had not overcomplicated the lore with so much extra stuff and focused instead on this obvious threat in the midst of war. Unfortunately though, once again, if the characters in the game don't seem to understand the scale of this danger, then why would the player? At first, I was disappointed in Immortals of Aveum for creating a new IP which just feels like another mishmash of ideas you've already seen before. By the end of the game though, I was disappointed that they had squandered the potential of the unique elements that the world building did have to offer, especially given how much good there is in the gameplay.
I hear they give better uniforms to the Lightless that can summon a little magic like this.
There's a war, Jack. It's not about the uniform.
Or maybe it's better boots.
Cheese, Jack.
Wait, what?
Soldiers get to eat real cheese. Boots are just extra.
For all of its very obvious faults, I do think there is a lot of good to be found in Immortals of Aveum. For a start, the 3-colour magic system in the game was instantly compelling to me, and I do think it is mostly pretty well implemented. Having red, green and blue magic and having to adapt which colour you use to deal with different coloured enemies is absurdly simple, but it also feels perfect. And though it's a bit difficult to get your head around at first, there are many different ways to change the way these different colours feel and play, both in your choice of a specific gauntlet weapon type and by picking skills from each of the 3 divisions of the skill tree. Again, this magic colour system probably isn't the most original idea, but it is very well implemented, and it goes further than just the combat too. The 3 magic colours, as well as the 3 connected abilities you learn throughout the game, allow you to solve a number of puzzles scattered around the world. None of these are especially challenging, but they are a lot of fun, and they do often require at least a couple of attempts to get the timing right and ensure you're using the right tools. There's enough variety here that I never got tired of these puzzles throughout my playthrough, just like I never got tired of the combat either. It's worth mentioning too that the levels are broken up with Metroidvania elements, offering plenty of treasure for those who want to double back with their new abilities and either work through harder puzzles or engage in more difficult combat scenarios. Unfortunately, I sincerely believe that a lot of people will be put off the game by the questionable acting and the dodgy writing before it ever reveals just how fun it can be. I definitely found the first hour or two to be a bit of a slog, not only because it takes a while to introduce a lot of the most fun mechanics, but also because the way they do introduce the combat did not convince me in the slightest that the magic first-person shooter thing was ever going to feel good. It definitely took some time to adjust to, but in the end it did feel great. I also think that now the game has dropped significantly in price and ended up on subscription services, even more people are going to bail before it ever gets going. At the end of the day though, it's the combat and puzzle solving loop which is going to take up most of your time in the game, and I do think that Immortals of Aveum is a success in that regard.
You wear shoes?
What's it to you?
Nothing at all.
The truth is that I don't think Immortals of Aveum ever stood a chance of succeeding in this modern gaming climate. Without studio pedigree known and trusted by players, and without a known IP, it was always going to be an uphill battle, and only absurdly positive word of mouth across the board could have helped it. The cards are well and truly stacked against full price, non-legacy IP, single player games like this. And even though I think the game has plenty to offer, it's hard to see a situation where it could have done well, even if it had released at a quieter time. I often hear this rhetoric trotted out that while gamers are constantly asking for new IP, they never actually support it when it comes out. It's not hard to see why developers cling to known brands and characters when a game like Immortals of Aveum releases and flops. But honestly, it is not the gamer's responsibility to support something just because it's new. It has to be a good game worth their money too. The difficult thing here is that I do think Immortals of Aveum is a good game. It's just that it's trapped inside a mediocre story framework, which makes it very hard to love. Ultimately, I wish that the game took itself more seriously, and I wish that the writers had cared more about making the player care. If you've played Immortals of Aveum already, I'd love to know what you think about it. And if you haven't, then I'd love to know what put you off. Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe and share if you'd like to hear me talk about more video game stuff. Otherwise, I'll see you next time around.